Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Professor Susan Watkins, Director of the Centre for Culture and the Arts at Leeds Beckett University. Welcome to October's Leeds Cultural Conversation, which is organised in partnership with Leeds City Council and the publisher Palgrave Macmillan. For more information about forthcoming talks in the series, please visit our website. You might also be interested in our free interactive event, Urban Dreams and Nightmares, which is part of the Being Human Festival, and it takes place on the 19th of November. There are brochures on the table outside, and our event is on page 25 if you want to book on. I'm going to be here. Yeah, we can. Based here at the museum, you will be able to talk to experts on urban history and culture and join short walks exploring the hidden meaning of buildings around Millennium Square. Children and young people will be able to add to an imagined cityscape, and there will be the chance to record your own urban dreams or nightmares with our acclaimed writer-in-residence, Booker-nominated novelist Sunjeev Sahota. So do look out for that event on 19th of November. So today I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Lisa Taylor. Lisa is the co-author of Media Studies, Texts, Institutions and Audiences, and also the author of A Taste for Gardening, Classed and Gendered Identities, the first analysis of the relationship between lifestyle media interest in gardening and cultural identities. Lisa's currently working on a project about art and northern landscape, and to coincide with Older People's Day, which was on the 3rd of October, she's talking to us today on the topic of remembering Firths carpets, responses to altered landscape in an ex-industrial community. So let's give her a big hand.
Thanks so much. Hi there everybody, and I'm really pleased to see interest in this project, so welcome. So this is, as Susan alluded to there, part of a bigger research project about responses and engagements with northern landscapes. I've just finished an article about artistic representations of the East Wolds in Yorkshire in David Hockney's series A Bigger Picture, where I interviewed a number of people there about what they thought about his works and how they chose to consume them. Now that article is going to come out in November. If anybody's interested in the reference, I will pass that on. So remembering Firths then is about what happened to a carpet factory located in Bailiff Bridge in Calderdale. Does anybody know that carpet factory or that village?
No, where it is.
No, it is. Okay, lovely. So I'm going to have to periodically just turn around and show you these images. This project draws on a group of generous people who were willing to give photographs and interviews to me. I'll detail how I gathered all the voices that I'm going to use. And also those people gave me many of these images that I'm going to show to you. So they're from ex-Firths workers and Bailiff Bridge residents, mostly. Now, I'm going to protect those people by not naming them. So I might sometimes use initials to indicate who they are. But if I ever do use names, they are actually pseudonyms. Okay, so I also ought to say that this project has been enabled by funding from Leeds Beckett University. So thanks to them for this as well. So this is Clifton Mill, and it's a mill that was demolished in 2002. And I want you to just notice some of the ornate brickwork in the mill, because I'm going to come back to that at the end, so I'm hoping to sort of come full circle. One of the problems with using photographs that belong to my respondents is that I often don't know the dates of the images, so some of you historians might come to me later and give me an idea, but I'm guessing that this might be the late 1800s. So I ought to also say that I'm personally connected to this project. I was born in Halifax and brought up on a council estate on the borders between Bailiff Bridge and Lycliffe. I went to the junior school in Bailiff Bridge, and like many people who lived in that area, my family worked in Firths, or at Firths. My mother worked in the setting. She later had me and then came back into the design department. Her sisters worked there, and my grandmother worked there. My stepfather, who had worked all his life in carpets, also worked there as a quality control manager. And in the 6-week holiday as an undergraduate, Dad would always very kindly get me a job at Firths Carpets, working in the offices, as well as a number of other jobs. I don't think I've got a mic. I think this is recording me. Shall I project? I will. I will. So some years after 2002, in around about 2006, I can remember driving up through the crossroads with Dad, and this is quite an everyday Monday moment really, and there was the great absence, it seemed to me, of the mill on the left as we drove up the hill. Now, while no words were actually spoken while we drove up the hill, I could sense a kind of feeling, a bristling, if you like, coming from Dad as we went past that space. So, if you think of it, he'd worked in the group of buildings that had been demolished for 35 plus years. And when I started work on thinking about northern landscapes, I really did return to that moment. Because I thought to myself, how does it feel when buildings like that, which have structured people's lives, are brought down, essentially? So if you take a look at this particular slide, you can see Bailiff Bridge from a different angle. And you can sense, I think, from this, the dominance of the mills. So we are at the heart of Bailiff Bridge here, at the main crossroads. We've got the Punch Bowl Club on the left, and then Clifton Mill and the two bridges going across the road, which comes down. Clifton House on this side actually stays where it is. And there's a monument in the centre, which I'll probably refer to later. Okay. This image, I think it's taken from around the mid-1990s, and there's a kind of neon sign which you can see on Clifton Mill towards the left, and we can see the row of shops there in the photograph. This one shows us coming down Birkby Lane. This is the group of buildings that were demolished as me and Dad drove up Birkby Lane that time. And this gives you another kind of view down into the mill. So just a really short history of Firths Carpets. In the 1860s, Firth, Willans and Co. were a blanket making factory, and they decided to extend their activities to carpet making. So Thomas Freeman Firth attended a sale apparently at the White Swan in Halifax and purchased a small worsted mill. It's not clear to me whether that's the same as Clifton Mill, at Bailiff Bridge, and opened Clifton Mill in 1867. This is a place where three becks meet, so there was a pure water supply. That crossroads provided transport links. There was a railway station at Brighouse. It was in easy reach for horse and wagon, and there were centres of population within walking distance at Wyke, Scholes, Brighouse and Hipperholm. There's also, of course, a decline in Firths Carpets. The company's bought out by a company called Readycut in 1997, which then became part of a group called Interface, which eventually closed the mill. So before 2002 then, I'd argue that the architectural presence of the factory mills of Firths Carpets really did dominate the visitor experience of Bailiff Bridge. Geographically located at the heart of the village, it had been a thriving manufacturer of fine woven carpets, which until its decline in the early 1980s, people were really proud of. You know, these were woven carpets, Axminster and Wilton, which the workers of Firths Carpets thought were amazing and aspired themselves to have those carpets. After its closure, when Clifton Mill's demolished, I'd argue that there's a vast material and affective void at the heart of the village. So from my own experience of growing up there in the 1970s, what I think was happening in that village was that the inhabitants held a sense of what someone called Valerie Walkerdine has called communal beingness, or a sense of shared safety within the community. And through that shared experience of setting up life in the mill village and making carpets, there was quite a strong and tight-knit community. But for me, that mill was a central physical object for the people. Its presence in the village crossroads had made the possibility of life for the village. So the aim of this research then was to try to look at that altered experience of place and the effective consequences for people once dependent on the now de-industrialised landscape of Bailiff Bridge. So I now want to show you some images of demolition. You can get a sense of what the village really went through. And again, these are images given to me by people who'd worked at Firths Carpets. So that shows you the same angle going down Birkby Lane, where we've got these huge spaces opening up, and at the corner there we can see the back of Clifton Mill. This one shows also the scaffolding that is placed around it as it's about to go, and you can see the presence of new housing there in that gap. Another one which shows the works when they came to the village to sweep out huge areas of the buildings. And then finally, this is a picture that I took when I was on one of my tours of the village with the people of the study. And this is still there to this day, this kind of hole at the centre with this kind of uneven rubble and weeds covering it. And inhabitants are still not quite clear what's going to happen. So, so this is taken in March 2016. So I wanted to think about people's social, practical experience of living in a de-industrialised village and how they situate themselves alongside a kind of changed story, if you like, of industrial heritage. How is it navigated? How is locality maintained within its changed identity? What happens to effective communal ties which bind people to a sense of place? So, this project lasted for 10 months. You can see me there, standing next to the hole in Bailiff Bridge. I put a call out to the local press to ask for respondents to come forward and talk about their experiences. And I got quite a good response. So I used Bailiff Bridge Community Centre and ran about 5 focus groups where I wanted to ask about the shared experience of working at Firths and then to talk about the village as it's experienced now. So I wanted to talk about reminiscences and present views about the village as a place in which to live and work. The focus groups would typically contain about 5 to 7 people in discussion with me. But because the project was also interested in spatial change, previous attachments, and loss of the village's architectural past, I also invited members of those focus groups to do walk and talk tours, where respondents would walk with me through the village buildings and past these eyesores, as one respondent called them. And this was to gather memories and to capture sensuous responses to change. My mother, who'd worked in the setting, recounts the clattering sound, the smell and the atmosphere of the working mill and its iconic significance when she worked there. So this is how I went into the project. So we would walk through Bailiff Bridge and look at the company's social clubs, the local park, housing and the row of shops. And I was able to gather photographs which have a connection to working at Firths or living in Bailiff Bridge along the way. So, and photographs were really important, it seemed to me, because as another expert on de-industrialisation argues, the reflection of the visual gives access to levels of emotion, meaning and feeling. And I wanted to build a kind of history, if you like, of an ex-industrial community. I also had the aim of opening a small photographic exhibition which opened in July in Bailiff Bridge at the very run-down small local library that I'd gone to as a child in the 70s. And we ran this, well, we're still running. The exhibition opened in July. And if you're interested, do go along to see more of these images, because I'm going to show you some of the ones that are actually there. So let me tell you something about the people of the study. I interviewed about 25 people. 23 took part in focus groups, and I did 18 walk and talk tours around Bailiff Bridge. This was an older sample of people. I would say that most of the respondents were over 60. The eldest respondent was 100 years old. There was a reasonably even gender balance, although we did put out particular calls for getting women to come forward. And this is a white sample, it must be said. All bar one had worked at Firths. Some of them had done levels of service like 52 years, for example, but typically around 40 years service for a lot of the respondents. So I interviewed weavers, creelers, or bobbin boys, as they told me they were called. I interviewed a salesperson, people who worked in export sales, the personal assistant to the managing director, women who worked in wages and in laboratory testing. And when I looked at their biographies, as one respondent told me, whole families had worked at Firths. And this was very much the case, just like me, in terms of my family working at Firths. So EF, as I would call him, had started working at Firths in 1931 as a weaver and had done the 52 years service. He was accompanied at the focus group by his niece, who had worked in lab testing from 1972 to 1981 when she left to have a daughter. Her father had died at the mill in 1981 of a heart attack, and she told me that all her aunts and uncles had worked at Firths. And this was a very typical kind of biography of the people that I spoke to. So what did I find? What did people tell me? So at the end we've got somebody working on a loom, and actually I'm not sure what people are doing in this photo. Mum? Because my mother is here and she might be able to tell us. What we know is that working at Firths could be physically hard. Shift work for the weavers told me that they'd never acclimatised their bodies to doing shift work. If you were working in the setting, you were on your feet the whole shift. And it was quite complex work working in the setting. One of the respondents said that there were 51 colours in one of the carpets, and that was complex work. While no one described work as monotonous or boring in the focus groups, I didn't really believe that. But there were lots of pranks and lots of having a laugh going on, which I think revealed a will to find banter and to find practices of play and having a laugh. So there was an incident where a weaver who'd cadged fags was given a roll-up which contained jute, which is a highly flammable material, and apparently never ever cadged a cigarette again. Another where a bucket of water was thrown over a senior manager. So this is what I was told. Well, one of the assistants decided he'd get cheeky this day, and I picked up the bucket of water and I chased him down between the looms, and when I got to the end I threw it. He ran round the corner, and who was stood at the other end? MF. Blasted all his boots and shoes, and he just looked at me and walked away. 5 minutes later, foreman, they called him X. He was 6 foot odd. I says, I know I'm in for a rollicking. He says, you are, but the rollicking is that you missed him. There were also strategies for fiddling, particularly when piecework was concerned. So there was the use of pliers, it seems, to sort of clip yarn in a quick manner. And there was the sense of beating the clocking machine that apparently added up how many rows you'd done. And there were industrial accidents. One weaver, who shook my hand when he joined one of the focus groups, had just 2 fingers on his right hand. And in fact, he'd had 3 accidents in total. This is how he introduced himself at the focus group. And anyway, I was initiated into being a creeler, and I had 3 accidents in very quick succession. One, I was sat on the side of a loom with my foot on a bar there, and the lever came down and took the back of my ankle off. The next one, I were up on a creel with a leather belt which you hung onto the creel and you put your weight on it, and you had a tub at the side of you and you replaced bobbins. I put the weight on the belt and it broke, and I fell off backwards and I landed on a wooden box from about 6 foot right on my coccyx. So I was walking around like Groucho Marx for about a fortnight. And then after that, I had a bad accident where I got my hand caught in a loom. And there were other things. I mean, apparently dust in those weaving sheds was really thick. So somebody said to me, and they got real severe lung problems. But not only that it was all the dust, you were actually eating it, because a lot of people later on, especially shift weavers when the canteen wasn't open, you had your meals on the machine, and if you didn't cover up your pot within a minute, it would be full of dust. Now, timing was incredibly important at Firths. You had your card pegged, or you were pennied by these commissionaires, as they were called. I mean, incidentally, that is the small fire brigade that Firths Carpets had got at its disposal. And these are the commissionaires who used to occupy the time office. So if you were late, you were clocked, essentially. So time had quite a significance. There was some possessiveness about the clock as well that had hung at Clifton Mill. So, and again, this is another image. I don't know what they're doing here. And I don't know if anybody knows. But this is an image that somebody has passed on. So as a place to work, Firths in Bailiff Bridge was incredibly noisy. As somebody said to me, there was some clatter you couldn't hear, and apparently in the weaving sheds you had to learn to lip read. Looms kept people awake at night in summer in Bailiff Bridge, as one respondent said to another. I didn't like your shift work because the clatter of looms in summer kept me awake at night. It was also incredibly busy. At tea time, people spilled out of the factory. As someone said, there were several double-decker buses. Someone else said, when they finished at tea time, you couldn't get across the road. And one of the things that came out in the walk and talk tours is that the village was pervaded by the smell of wet wool. And it gave the village a distinctive sense of purpose, I think. Someone described it as wet dog. This was noted during walk and talk as a missing aroma. I mean, the wool has a certain smell, someone said. When dyeing it, it has a very unique, it smelt of textiles. And of course, and this won't surprise you, Firths had a very family feel, although this was said to be especially strong before the takeover in 1968 of Redicut. Many of the respondents said this, the family feel of Firths. So as we work through some of these images, is that the setting? Is that the setting? No. And I can't actually date some of these. And I think some of these images were actually used as marketing images for Firth, although I can't be sure. While gender demarcation was pretty much denied in the focus groups, there were aspects of work that seemed to be populated by women. So the sewing, the setting and the finishing, I think, were largely carried out by female workers, as we can see here. I don't know if any of you know Nick Hedges and Hugh Bainan's book, Born to Work, where he takes images of, he's got lots of pictures of steel workers in Bilston in the West Midlands in the 1980s. Nick Hedges famously did the post of the shelter. It's quite an important British photographer. These images remind me of some of that. This one, I think, possibly the 70s. Okay, so this is a picture of the office, and 4 respondents occupied, I would say out of the sample, occupied a more elevated role in the firm. This was the white-collar side of the factory, and social demarcation was definitely indicated by the 4 different canteens, depending on where you worked in Firth. I mean, this is an image of one of the canteens. I'm not certain who would come to this one, but I don't think it was management. There was quite a lot of interdepartmental sport as well, where some of those contiguous class frictions were no doubt played out. So I think the football teams, the managers got to play the workers, which was one of the terms that was used in the interviews. royalty. I think this is the Queen. There are also pictures of Princess Margaret and John Major given to me by the people by the ex-workers. And of course, Firths won a contract for QE2. It served Concorde. It made lightweight carpet for aircraft, and so on and so forth. It had a big contract with Marks and Spencer's as well, I think, during the 80s and 90s. And there's a tremendous pride in what people made. That idea of making kept coming up. So there's a sense that Firths was very genuinely a community, and there was a great sense of paternalism in the interviews. People talked about the idea that Firths looked after people, and there was a great deal of pride in the self-sufficiency of the workings of Firths. It had its own water supply, its own fire brigade. I don't know how effective it was. There was some sort of jibes about that during the interviews. There was CCA approval of the weight of carpet through laboratory testing that was in-house. There was a football field. There was a house that housed visitors called Clifton House. And actually through the interviews, so many people's names kept coming up. So that there was almost a sense in which the community was being recreated in some of those research encounters, I would suggest. So also within Bailiff Bridge, quite a lot of the people talked about the fact that they didn't really need to go any further than Bailiff Bridge to have a living within that community. I would roll out of bed and walk down to work, someone told me. Sometimes workers in the office would pick up their children and go home for dinner, having an hour and a half for dinner, somebody told me. There were local shops where all the shopping could take place, and there were tremendous social clubs. I mean, this dates back, and I do know because this did make the local press. In 1967, they had a Hawaiian night, so I don't quite know what they're doing on space operas. But there's some quite fun pictures. There was an archery club. This is a photograph from 1963. And there were certainly outings and fairs. I mean, again, I don't know what this is about. Firths carpets sell to the world, so that must have been some sort of, and the stag at the front, which we find on marketing brochures. I'm guessing that that's Huddersfield Station, but I can't be sure. All those buildings behind that van are all gone now. Okay, so I then, of course, invited people to talk about demolition and what the village was like after 2002. And they came back and gave me a number of responses to this. So the local press files that I've found in Halifax Central Library, where I've done quite a bit of archive work, narrativise the decline of Firth's takeover, which begins with Redicut and then later on Interface. So we do see a decline in the workforce steadily across that time frame. Out of the sample, and I guess I could take you back to some of those images of demolition, if you don't mind, because that might illustrate some of the things that where shall we go? Perhaps to there. There was just one person who really denied that the demolition had had any effect on him. He was a sales representative, so not always based at the factory, so perhaps he didn't have quite the attachment to the buildings and the place. Had a much more distanced approach and had deliberately lived outside Bailiff Bridge and didn't want his flexible working hours to be noticed by other Firths workers in Bailiff Bridge. That was one of the reasons. So he said to me during one of the walk and talk tours, he said, to be absolutely honest, Lisa, I mean, I feel no pangs when I go past Firths carpets. I don't feel any... I think the shame is all these jobs have gone. But he was an unusual figure in relation to the other sorts of responses that I got. because 2 or 3 respondents took extensive photographs from a range of angles to witness the buildings coming down. So someone called JB said this to me. Back when I started going up White Lane and up the railway banking, and I started taking photographs there, and I've got 30 different photographs of different stages of the demolition, and I've sent most of them through to Lisa, you know. Right from the one where it was intact, totally intact was Clifton Mills. Then gradually it goes down and down and down. So in this exchange, the other respondent talks of her shock at the coming to Bailiff Bridge post-demolition. So she doesn't watch any of the buildings come down, but she comes back suddenly. Well, I didn't even know it were coming down because I don't live in this area anymore. I live in Bradford. So JB says, I've even pictures by the bottom of Birkby Lane where the bridge was across. And then it wasn't across. It was gone. Then someone else comes in. Well, I lived in Brighouse at the other side of the river, and my mum and dad lived at White, so we came through Bailiff Bridge, you know, most days really to see it, and JB comes back in. Well, I come to Brighouse, I come to Halifax every week on the bus now, since I lost my wife. I come on the 255, I don't get in the car because it goes right past my house and it comes down through here, the bus, and every time I come down here, I always think, God, how many years I spent there. You know, what were there and what were there. You know, it breaks your brain every time. Some came down to actually witness the demolition. So JL says, I remember I came on the first day that they put this wrecking ball into it, and I was standing at the other side of the road watching it, and it started to come down. And I sort of welled up with feelings. JB says, yeah, you would do. JL, when I turned round, there were 3 or 4 other people that I all knew that had worked at Firths at different places. And you could see that they were in a similar sort of state. It was very emotional. Now, in my own naivete, when I first started this project, Clifton Mill was my main sort of object of analysis. But actually there were lots of places around the mill that came down. And I was challenged, if you like, through the research process on this. One respondent had found the disappearance of a place which had particular meaning during the walk and talk tour. So she's talking to me about a person. So she says, so I say, what's she called? Linda. Linda X she was. Her mother worked in the canteen. Yes, is that... Oh, I know it's gone. So I say, well, I've not been down here. What's gone? The dam. Laughs. There used to be I used to walk. If I went down to dispatch, this was all dispatch, stock room and dispatch up there, and I used to come, and this was the pattern room, and our officers were up there, obviously. I used to come down the back steps if I was to go to dispatch and walk down here, and then there was and it's all been filled in. There was a dam, like a mill dam or whatever. There, here. I said, what, literally on this car park, just here? Here, yeah, I used to walk down there and on here, and all this was a dam. I don't know what they used it for. Yeah, I suppose originally they probably used it in the mill, didn't they, for the water and things years ago. So we go on. And she just says, wow. I say, sorry, no, I'll go back a little bit. You can drive in there now. That must be a garage or something. Unbelievable. This has changed. And I used to there were loads of trees, and in winter all the trees dropped, and it was a nightmare if it was wet. In fact, I remember that somebody else, X, falling and breaking his arm, walking down there, yeah. So I come in, and then she goes, wow. And I say, that will pass the rhythms of the working day, you know. Yeah, you know, I just thought, oh, we'll go past the dam today. Oh, that's sad. Very sad. Yeah. So this is what used to be the stock room. Can we go in there? So during the walk and talk interviews, there were moments where people actually discovered parts of the mill that had gone. For others, the loss of the building was equated with the loss of history. As someone said to me, no, it was not good for me, not good to see. It's like 100 years of history, isn't it, from the past, from 1895 until now sort of thing, gone down. And another respondent kept repeating the same phrase as we walked past new buildings or stood in front of the empty space where the Clifton Mill used to be. That's history gone, she kept saying. For others, the process of demolition was worse than the trauma of building loss. One respondent said that broken windows, seeing pigeons flying through the Clifton Mill, and I think he means this part of it when it, well, there must have been different stages. So he said this to me, and it seems that Interface had come and were having a meeting with Firths and referred to this building. Derelict and what have you, it looked awful. And I once came to a meeting which Interface and a marketing meeting about new products. And they actually had it in Clifton Mills, which was, and this side was empty. And the idiot, shall we say, that was leading the meeting said, "We've come here to this wonderful place," and pointed to the derelict. I thought, well, it wasn't our fault that the place has closed down, basically. You know, I'm not saying it was his fault, but you know, he made a point about that, and then I could have clocked him right then. It was disgusting. So, another response in the focus group was from one man who was incredibly protective, partly because his parents had worked at Firth. He himself had owned a shop opposite, which I'll talk about in a moment. Waddington's, actually, and often that shop was called Waddy's. And he was particularly emotional about the closure of Firths. So he said, "It's devastating, I don't want to see your photographs." "No," says JW, "because it would devastate me." "The demolition ones?" "Yeah, I saw it because I was in the shop at the time, because I took the business over in 1993 or something. I was teaching at Greenhead College, and then I took the business over, and then I saw it come down. And daft as it may seem, I knew the demolition man. So I've got bits of the facade of Firth's carpets, which I've put, and I'll come back to that in a moment. In fact, I'll come back to it now, if that's okay. So I did actually get to go and visit this person at their home, because he did have something rather special. And in fact, I'll show you. I'm going on to this slide. And I'm wrapping up now, so I'm just giving you the final. Oh. Okay, so JW. Well, I think I was still working, I was in the shop, I can't remember, or I knew about it. And as it turned out, the chap who was in charge of the demolition was on our lane. He was on Woodbottom Lane, and I said to him, unfortunately they pulled it was the ornate work that was made out of pot work. Can you remember that I showed you at the beginning? They obviously had it made and put in there if you get a picture of the original building. I can let you have one of the pot work pieces if you want, because I've got a spare bit. And we did actually use part of Clifton Mill, and it is still in Bailiff Bridge Library on display there. So we're very grateful to him for lending it to us. So there is some talk about the history of the building. Yeah, we've got a photograph on the front of the building because the most ornate part was in the middle row. Now, I don't know whether that was the first bit, because you could see there were different stages of it, and yeah, which was the first and which was the second, because I think it was the sort of felting mill or something before that, and they made the same flush mills at Heckmondwike. It was owned by them. And so I come in and I say, so we're crossing Bradford Road. This is partly to mark my location on the tape. So you said all this to him, and this man who was doing the demolition, and he says, yeah, and I said, can I have some of that? And he said, oh, I'll try and save you some. And I said, can you save me Clifton Mills? So a lot of the people at Firths in the focus groups were left pretty much bewildered by some of the pieces that they'd remembered from the village that had simply gone missing. So there was the clock, the fountain, the horse trough that had been part of the monument in the centre of the village. that they simply don't know where those items went. They still have a sense of the bewilderment of those lost pieces. For others, there's an unwelcome opening up of space that means, as one person put it, you can see. So there's this idea that open space provides new views that just don't feel right. You can see Waddy's shop. It doesn't look right, said one of the respondents. And there was this exchange as a final reflection on community during one of the groups. And this is my final bit of respondent voice, if you like. I was really surprised, you know, when a few years later Firths went, because Bailiff Bridge without Firths doesn't seem like a place, really. DG, well, it's nowhere now, is it? JM, it's nothing, is it? It's just somewhere you drive through if you're going up that road. That's how I feel about it. I mean, there's nothing that I think, I don't know, it's just made it into a nothing place, really. GH, it's all houses now. JM, it's just where people live. NM, sort of joined to Brighouse now, isn't it? GH, what sort of jobs are all these people doing who live in these new houses? Yeah, I know. Well, they're probably going to motorway to go to wherever. What sort of work are they doing? And then finally, it's like a person without a personality, isn't it? Now, during the course of the research, the respondents kept trying to get me to contact a local historian, who I respect and who is known. But I kept saying to them, I'm not actually doing that kind of work. I said, it's your experience that interests me. And one of the respondents reflected back to me and said, it's about the history of the community then. But what really struck me about that sort of sense of them always wanting me to direct me to this particular historian, is that no one had ever really bothered to ask them about the trauma of this experience. And it doesn't seem to me that there's any provision from anywhere to try to attend to the trauma of these kinds of losses. Just on a lighter note, this is the invite that we gave to the local respondents. We had a private opening of the photographic exhibition, which houses the piece of Clifton Mill, old pieces of machinery. There's a comptometer, which was a counting machine, which did damage the hands of the woman who'd used it when she held them up in the focus group. All her fingers splayed in a different direction. So people really did give their bodies to Firths carpets in that sense. And we chose this particular image to celebrate Firths, remembering Firths at the heart of Bailiff Bridge. Do try to get along to that exhibition if you get a chance. It's very small, but it houses these sorts of photographs. And unfortunately, I was on holiday when one of the ex-workers from Firths took his elderly mum, Chris Parker, who I'm yet to meet, Evelyn, and they went to look at the exhibition. You can see faintly in the background some of the images that we've displayed. And I think they very much enjoyed the exhibition.
Okay, does anyone have any questions, please?
Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of buildings and memories. Had that building been listed and repurposed, maybe apartments for young professionals or whatever it is that we do nowadays, would that have been less of a trauma for people in the village, or maybe more of a trauma because the difference would be so strong? And maybe your mother might have a take, I don't know.
Mum, did you hear that question? I don't know how to answer that really, and I think there's a whole range of research about planning in relation to this project that could be done. It's got the potential for that. Why is it that some spaces, and I know we've got expertise in the room on this, why are some spaces retained and listed and valued and regenerated? And why are other spaces abandoned and taken down without consulting anybody? And I think that is a really pertinent question, and one that, you know, when you start a project, of course, you know, one of the things that happens is I'm opening this up, and people are going to ask me about that, and
well, a lot of the senses are gone, the smell and the sound, that's
absolutely
completely gone. And is it a whole thing, or can you just take bits and make it okay?
Well, we don't know what's going to happen to the whole. I don't think anybody really knows.
I think the pop's bought that.
The Corp has bought it.
And the last memorial part, you know, that's beautiful now, and that's just got another award this year.
Yeah, where the cenotaph is.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, we're familiar with that. That was part of the walk and talk.
And the biggest problem is when the trough and the memorial fountain went.
Yeah.
Nobody knows where that went.
Quite so, yeah. Yeah. So, you know, this idea that valued objects become unresolved problems that are...
And the punch bowl, have you seen the plaque?
Yes.
Big Civic Trust, we got that up.
Yes. I mean, that pub is now a pest control centre. So it's no longer a hub.
Everything's gone.
Yeah.
The club's gone, the chapel's gone, the
Yeah.
pub's gone, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one respondent said that she felt that Bailiff Bridge was a haunted place where, you know, they would now set ghosts really in its place. Yeah.
Yes, Stuart.
You touched upon class, feelings of class distinctions within the factory. Was that reflected in, say, trade union membership amongst the workers? How important was that?
I think that's a really interesting point, and it seems to me that dare I say this, because I haven't, I might get challenged, but I think that textiles has been under-examined. You might know different. But I think trade union membership and the closure of miners and the mine works in this country has had a great deal of attention. Partly because of the union, you know, what happened during the 80s and what Thatcher did to the unions and so on. Not many of my respondents had very much interest in trade unions, interestingly, although they did talk about being members. And I'm sure, I know that class is really important in this piece. But my more middle class members were in the minority, actually. And it was really difficult to get hold of some people, because while I talk here about a great deal of nostalgia and sentimentality about Firths, clearly, and that needs some theorising, some people were made redundant when the cuts were made, and there were some quite bitter people who did refuse to take part in research as a result of that. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but when I tried to get hold of some of the more senior people, they said they couldn't bear to come and talk about it.
Which hints at some maybe deep divisions within the workforce. I'm remembering back to Richard Hoggart's work, Uses of Literacy, and he's describing Hunslet in some of the ways that you've been describing Beckett Bridge. And there's an absence of trade union, of a trade union life or membership, but we do know that it was very heavily present.
It's quite interesting. I mean, there are a good deal of denials as well in the research. So we interviewed, and my thanks to Laura Ettenfield, who was a great research assistant on this project too. We interviewed a group of all women to see if we could get some sense of the gender relations at Firths, and it was really denied that gender was a category that mattered. Huge amount of fierce protection of Firths as a paternalistic firm that looked after people. There was no sexism, which of course I'm afraid I don't believe. They said that there was no sexism. There wasn't one, no.
Anyone else?
Can I just ask about the younger generation, sort of after the mill closed down? Are they still there, Bailiff Bridge or Brick House, or have they moved away? What, you know, it's interesting in terms of what's their cultural memory of the place that, you know, was so essential for the community.
Are you talking about me? Because it was sense. I think I probably am. As a middle-aged person, the younger generation who would remember and be part of that younger group doing the 6 weeks holiday filing. We just couldn't get hold of anybody younger than 60 for the research project. But I mean, there is scope, I imagine, for people for sure, to talk about Bailiff Bridge. Do you mean in the now?
Yeah, I suppose, well, both really. I mean, you are the younger generation, in the sense that you were part of that, but then, you know, the generation below that.
Yes.
Because you talked about haunting, you know, does that place kind of haunt, is there cultural haunting of that place and what it means, or is it just, you know, has it become a kind of non-place for them? Do you know what I mean? Has it been raised completely for that generation?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, one of the things, and this is about questions of mobility really, after the walk and talks I would take respondents for a cup of tea. It's the least you could do, having got the generosity of people. Up to likely tea rooms, and actually some of the respondents spoke to me then about their present lives and about the things they felt proud of. And one of the key features of those talks was that people talked about their children and where they were now. And what struck me in those findings was that while the people that I'd talked to had stayed in Bailiff Bridge and in that area all their lives, most of their children had mobility. They were working abroad or they were working in different parts of the country, but they had much greater opportunity to go elsewhere. And very few of them, I think, would be housed or lived. I don't think any of them had stayed in Bailiff Bridge. So that gives you a kind of sense of what the younger people were doing.
Lisa, I really enjoyed that. Thank you. I don't know the area at all, and that might sit behind this question, which is more about language in a way. I was really struck when you said that the place affected all the senses. Sight, sounds, unexpected, the feel, but also the taste with all the dust that was there, the smell that came through. Those are classic features that usually lead to language that memorialises landscape. You know, affects every sense, and they're all explored. Do you think there is an emerging discourse about these sort of places, which would be a mixture of different languages, like your project, local people's experiences, those people very aware of historians who you might have gone to talk to but you didn't, your own language that you're using and how that connects with academic work? Is there a sense of an emerging language, or is that not possible? Is it more about objects and what people attach to them?
It's a great question, of course. You seem to be implying the idea that there are different registers, though, at work in making descriptions. I mean, I certainly came across local vernacular, and I think perhaps that came through when I read out some of the responses. But that is a really interesting point, and I can't provide an answer to it, but it probably is a really good analytical frame for looking back at the data with. So thanks for that. But no, I can't say that I've noted that, but I will. There's so much data to get through.
Yes.
And I presented you with a flea bite, literally. I mean, there was so much data to get through, embedded somehow in the transcripts. But I should take that to that analytical work.
Okay. Zoe.
No, it's sorry.
No, I didn't have that.
Oh. I'm just thinking of whether you've found evidence of different families working at the mill, interacting socially outside. I'm thinking of the case of Tetler's Brewery when that was demolished. And a lot of the people who worked there remember going on holiday together. Different families coming together, going out socially in Leeds, being involved, bringing people together in that sort of way. Did you find any evidence of that?
Well, I absolutely found evidence of all the social activities and sports clubs. I mean, there was table tennis, football, racing, just an absolute plethora. I don't know if perhaps I didn't even say. There were so many sports clubs. It was quite extraordinary, really. I mean, I think that was a corporate device for keeping people together and possibly to play out those contiguous frictions that I alluded to earlier. But you're talking, I think, about other firms coming in and a kind of is that what you mean? That there was a meeting of other mill workers or...
Yes, not through those clubs as such,
yeah.
But just organising themselves and going on their annual holiday together, which we came across very strongly when interviews with etc.
Well, I certainly know that there were many outings to Blackpool, and that image of the station where we've got all those expectant people, trips to London, and someone gave me lots of documents that showed, tickets and lists of people's names and so on. I did acquire some of that material as well, kindly, but not beyond Firths. It was very much sort of just within the walls of Firths carpets.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Lisa. Let's give her another clap.